The flames had already consumed half the house when Jake Martinez crashed through the front door. Thick black smoke choked his lungs. That's when he heard it, a desperate whimper beneath a collapsed bookshelf. Two glowing eyes stared back through the darkness. A tiny black puppy, trembling violently. Jake scooped it up, tucked it inside his jacket, and ran. 3 weeks later, at the vet clinic, Dr. Sarah Chen's face went pale. She picked up the phone with shaking hands. "I need wildlife services, immediately." What Jake had rescued wasn't a puppy at all. Jake Martinez had been a firefighter for 15 years, and in that time, he'd seen just about everything. He'd carried unconscious children from smoke-filled rooms, their small bodies limp and terrifyingly fragile in his arms. He'd pulled drivers from mangled vehicles on the highway, working with the jaws of life to cut through twisted metal while gasoline dripped dangerously close to hot engine parts. He'd once spent 6 exhausting hours cutting through collapsed concrete to reach a construction worker trapped in a building collapse, talking to the man the entire time to keep him conscious, to keep him fighting. He'd seen people at their absolute worst, panicked, injured, staring down their own mortality with eyes wide with terror. And he'd seen them at their very best, neighbors running back into burning buildings to save strangers they barely knew, parents shielding their children with their own bodies without a second thought, ordinary people becoming extraordinary heroes in moments of crisis when courage mattered most than anything else. But nothing, absolutely nothing in his 15 years of experience had prepared him for what happened that cold November night on Maple Ridge Road. The call came in at exactly 11:47 p.m. Jake remembered checking his watch, remembered the fleeting thought that his shift was supposed to end in 13 minutes, and he'd been looking forward to getting home, grabbing a beer, and watching the game he'd recorded. Structure fire, fully involved, possible occupants still inside. The address came through the radio in the clipped, urgent tone of the dispatcher who'd been doing this job long enough that nothing made her voice waver anymore. Jake felt that familiar surge of adrenaline that came with every emergency call, that electric jolt that sharpened his senses and cleared his mind, no matter how many years he'd been doing this, no matter how routine some calls had become. Jake's crew arrived 6 minutes and 32 seconds later. 6 minutes that felt like both seconds and hours simultaneously. Time doing that strange compression and expansion it always did when lives were on the line. The 2-story house was already half consumed by flames that licked hungrily at the night sky, like the tongues of some ancient beast, casting an orange glow that could be seen from blocks away, drawing neighbors out of their homes to stand and stare. Thati, heat hit Jake's face even before he got out of the truck. A wall of scorching air that made his eyes water instantly and sent his skin prickling with the warning of dangerous temperatures. Black smoke poured from every window, thick and toxic, the kind of smoke that could kill in minutes if you breathed enough of it, the kind that turned lungs into charred tissue and left victims dead from smoke inhalation long before the flames ever touched them. The sound was deafening. The roar of the fire like a living thing, the crash of falling timber as the structure weakened and gave way, the hiss and spray of water from the hoses as his crew began their attack on the blaze with the practiced precision of men who'd done this 1,000 times before. The family had made it out, thank God. That was always the first priority, the first question every firefighter asked. Are there people inside? Jake could see them huddled together on the lawn across the street, still in their pajamas, wrapped in blankets that neighbors had brought out. A young couple. The husband couldn't have been more than 30, with a thin build and the kind of face that probably smiled easily under normal circumstances, though right now it was blank with shock. His wife was younger, maybe mid-20s, pretty in that girl-next-door way, with her hair in a messy ponytail and tears streaming down her face. Their 2 kids clung to their mother like barnacles, a boy and a girl who looked to be about 5 and 7 years old. The kids were crying, that hiccuping, gulping kind of crying that comes from sheer terror, and Jake's heart ached for them. The father had his arms around all 3 of them, trying to be the rock they needed, but Jake could see his hands shaking. Everything they owned was in that house. Photo albums chronicling babies' first steps, and birthday parties and Christmas mornings. Baby clothes saved in boxes in the attic, too precious to throw away even after the children had outgrown them. Wedding gifts from relatives who'd passed away. The accumulated memories and possessions of years of life together, all of it turning to ash and smoke right before their eyes. Jake and his crew went through their protocols with the precision that came from years of training and experience drilled until it became muscle memory. Captain Morrison, a grizzled veteran with 30 years on the job, coordinated the water attack from outside, his voice calm and authoritative over the radio as he directed the hoses to the areas where they could do the most good, where they might still save something. Lieutenant Barnes handled crowd control, his imposing presence and no-nonsense attitude keeping the growing number of curious neighbors at a safe distance, because the last thing they needed was a civilian getting hurt. Jake and his partner, Tommy Chen, were assigned to search and rescue, which meant going inside to make absolutely certain no one was trapped, because families panic and sometimes forget a visiting relative or don't realize a teenager snuck back in to save a pet. "Family says they all made it out," Captain Morrison told them through the radio, his voice crackling with static. "But I want a full sweep anyway. Check every room, every closet. Make sure." Jake nodded, even though Morrison couldn't see him, pulled his mask into place, felt the familiar constriction as the straps tightened around his head. He checked his air tank. 30 minutes of breathable air, more than enough for a standard search, and followed Tommy through what had been the front door, now just a gaping maw leading into hell. The heat inside was intense even through his protective gear. The turnout coat was rated to withstand temperatures of over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, had all the latest heat-resistant technology, but Jake could still feel the furnace-like air pressing against him from all sides, trying to cook him alive. Visibility was nearly zero, just thick, roiling smoke illuminated by the orange glow of flames dancing across the ceiling. Jake swept his flashlight back and forth in the standard search pattern they'd taught him at the academy 20 years ago, looking for bodies, for movement, for anything that might indicate someone was still inside and running out of time. They cleared the first floor systematically, room by room, the way they'd been trained. Living room. Clear, though the furniture was already engulfed. Kitchen. Clear, the cabinets burning like kindling. Bathroom. Clear, the plastic shower curtain melted into an abstract sculpture. A small office or den. Clear, the desk and bookshelves collapsing even as Jake checked behind them. The stairs to the second floor had already collapsed, the wooden steps reduced to charred stumps, making the upper level completely inaccessible. That's when Jake was doing a final sweep of what looked like it had been the living room, and he heard it over the roar of the fire and the sound of his own breathing inside the mask. Not a human sound. Something else entirely. A high-pitched whimpering that somehow cut through everything else, a desperate plea for help that Jake's brain registered as distress, as a living thing in mortal danger. He followed the sound to the far corner of the room. A large bookshelf had collapsed, its shelves spilling hardcover novels and family photo albums across the floor, where they were curling and blackening in the heat. But the collapse had created a small pocket of space beneath it, a tiny cave where the smoke hadn't quite reached yet. And there, pressed against the wall as far back as it could possibly go, were 2 glowing eyes reflecting his flashlight beam like tiny golden coins in the darkness. The puppy was no bigger than a softball, covered in soot that made its fur look gray instead of whatever color it was supposed to be, shaking so violently that Jake could see it even through the smoke. It couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. Barely, past the age when it should still be with its mother. Jake didn't even think. Thinking took time, and time was something this puppy didn't have. He just reached in, his gloved hand looking enormous next to the tiny creature, scooped it up as gently as his bulky gloves would allow, and tucked it inside his turnout coat. The puppy's heart hammered against his chest through the layers of protective gear, beating so fast it felt like a hummingbird's wings. Jake made his way back outside, moving as quickly as he could while still being careful not to trip over debris or step through weakened floorboards. The family on the lawn looked confused when Jake emerged with a small bundle tucked against his chest. "Is that a puppy?" the woman asked, her voice hoarse from smoke and crying. "Was it yours?" Jake asked, though he already suspected the answer from their expressions. They shook their heads in unison. They'd never seen it before. Didn't even know there was a dog in the house. Maybe it had wandered in through an open window. The house had been sitting empty for a week before they'd moved in, they explained. Or maybe someone had abandoned it in the empty lot next door, and it had found its way into the house seeking shelter from the cold November nights. Either way, the family was heading to stay with relatives across the state in Oregon, packing into their van tonight with nothing but the pajamas on their backs and whatever kindness their family could offer. They couldn't take an animal with them, especially not one they'd never seen before. Didn't know anything about. Jake looked down at the trembling black ball of fur peeking out from his jacket. Those eyes looked up at him with something that felt almost like trust, or maybe just desperation for any port in a storm. "I'll take care of it," he heard himself say, the words coming out before his brain had fully processed the commitment he was making. And just like that, Jake Martinez became the owner of a puppy he knew nothing about, a creature that would change his entire life in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. And that was that. He named the puppy Shadow because of its jet-black fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating an almost supernatural darkness that made the little creature look like a moving shadow, even in bright sunlight. Even when Jake shined a flashlight directly on Shadow's coat, it seemed to drink in the light rather than bouncing it back the way normal dog fur did. For the first few days, Jake worried constantly, obsessively, that Shadow wouldn't make it. The puppy was severely dehydrated when Jake got him home, his gums pale and tacky when Jake checked them the way he'd learned to check for dehydration in humans. Jake tried to get fluids into Shadow, offering water in a shallow bowl, then trying to hand-feed water with an eyedropper. But Shadow seemed listless and unresponsive, his tiny body limp in Jake's hands. Jake set up a comfortable bed in a cardboard box lined with the softest towels he owned, placed it in his bedroom right next to his bed where he could keep an eye on Shadow through the night. He set his phone alarm to go off every 2 hours, and each time it buzzed him awake, Jake would lean over and check on the tiny creature, half expecting each time to find that Shadow had stopped breathing, that he'd failed to save the life he'd pulled from the fire. But Shadow was tougher than he looked, had a will to survive that seemed almost fierce for something so small. By the 3rd day, the puppy's eyes were brighter, more alert, tracking Jake's movements around the room. By the 5th day, Shadow was strong enough to climb out of the cardboard box, a feat that required impressive determination, given that the box walls were taller than Shadow was long, and explore Jake's bedroom, sniffing everything with intense curiosity, his tiny nose working overtime. And that's when the feeding problems began, problems that made Jake seriously consider rushing Shadow to an emergency vet. Shadow refused to eat anything Jake offered. Jake tried different brands of puppy food, starting with premium organic brands that cost more per pound than Jake spent on his own food, then working his way through veterinarian-recommended formulas that promised complete nutrition for growing puppies. He tried the cheap grocery store stuff that the guy at the pet store swore every dog loved, that he'd never seen a dog refuse. He tried softening the kibble with water until it was basically mush. He tried mixing it with puppy milk replacer, the kind that was supposed to mimic mother's milk. He tried warming it up in the microwave to make it more aromatic and appealing. Nothing worked. Shadow would approach the bowl, sniff it carefully with that tiny black nose, then look up at Jake with those amber eyes as if to say, "You've got to be kidding me with this garbage," and walk away with an air of disdain that seemed impossible for a creature so small. Jake was starting to panic. He knew enough about puppies to know that one this young needed to eat regularly, or it would die. Their tiny bodies didn't have enough reserves to skip meals. He called his sister Maria, who lived across town and had 2 dogs of her own, a pair of beagles that were fat and happy, and ate anything that even remotely resembled food. "Have you tried raw meat?" Maria suggested when Jake explained the problem. "I know it sounds weird, and my vet would probably kill me for suggesting it, but some dogs have really sensitive stomachs when they're young. All that processed stuff doesn't agree with them. Their systems can't handle it." Jake hadn't tried raw meat. It seemed counterintuitive. Wasn't raw meat dangerous for puppies? Weren't you supposed to cook everything to kill bacteria and parasites? But he was desperate, and desperate people try desperate things. He drove to the grocery store and bought a small package of raw chicken breast, the kind, that came on a little styrofoam tray wrapped in plastic. He brought it home, cut a tiny piece no bigger than his thumbnail, and offered it to Shadow, holding it out on his palm and half expecting another rejection. The puppy's reaction was immediate and dramatic. Shadow snatched the meat from Jake's fingers so fast that Jake barely saw him move, the tiny jaws snapping shut with surprising force. The puppy devoured it in seconds, swallowing it almost whole, then looked up at Jake with an expression that clearly demanded, "More now." "Okay then," Jake said, laughing with relief that flooded through him like a warm wave. "Guess you're a raw food guy. Should have known you'd be high maintenance." Over the next 3 weeks, Shadow transformed from a sickly, soot-covered creature on death's door into something that took Jake's breath away. The puppy's coat developed a shine that seemed almost metallic in certain lights, each hair catching the sun and throwing it back in a way that was mesmerizing to watch. Shadow's body filled out, the ribs that had been visible under his skin disappearing as muscle and healthy fat developed. And Shadow grew at what Jake was certain was an impossible rate, faster than any puppy he'd ever seen or heard about. Jake had grown up with dogs. His family had always had a golden retriever or 2 around the house, big friendly things that shed everywhere and loved everyone. He knew what normal puppy growth looked like, and this wasn't it. By the end of the 2nd week, Shadow had doubled in size. By the end of the 3rd week, Jake started to seriously wonder if maybe Shadow had some wolf-dog hybrid in his bloodline. He'd heard about people breeding dogs with wolves, though he knew it was controversial and illegal in many states, and he knew that wolf dogs grew faster and larger than regular dogs. The puppy's ears seemed too large for his head, pointed and mobile, swiveling independently to track sounds in a way that reminded Jake more of a satellite dish than a dog's ears. Shadow's snout was elongated, longer and narrower than the blunt muzzles Jake was used to seeing on dogs. The paws were absolutely massive, comically oversized for Shadow's body, suggesting that this puppy was going to grow into something very large indeed. But it was the eyes that really got to Jake, that made him lie awake some nights wondering what exactly he'd brought into his home. Amber eyes that seemed to see right through him, that looked at him with an intelligence that was almost unsettling. Not the simple, trusting intelligence of a dog, but something different, something wild. Shadow never barked, not once in 3 weeks, not even when startled or excited. Instead, The puppy made soft whining sounds that ranged from contented to anxious depending on the context. And occasionally, usually late at night when Jake was trying to sleep, Shadow would make a sound that was almost like a howl but quieter, more mournful. A lonely sound that made Jake's chest ache with an emotion he couldn't quite name. When Jake took Shadow to the dog park, against his better judgment, because Shadow was technically too young for the dog park, but Jake thought socialization was important, the puppy showed zero interest in other dogs. In fact, Shadow seemed to actively avoid them, always staying close to Jake's side, watching the other animals with what looked like suspicion, or even fear. Other dog owners noticed, too, commented on it with that friendly concern that dog people have for each other. "Your puppy's not very social," one woman said as her golden retriever bounded past, all waggling tail and friendly enthusiasm. "Still young," Jake replied with a casual shrug, but privately he was beginning to worry that something was seriously wrong with Shadow. "Give him time. He's been through a lot." But time didn't seem to help. Shadow never played with dog toys, showed absolutely no interest in tennis balls or rope tugs or squeaky toys, all the things puppies were supposed to go crazy for. But the puppy was endlessly fascinated by Jake's movements, following him everywhere, living room to kitchen to bathroom and back, observing everything he did with those intense amber eyes that missed nothing. At night, Shadow refused to sleep in the expensive dog bed Jake had bought, the orthopedic kind that was supposed to be perfect for growing puppies. Instead, the puppy would curl up at the foot of Jake's bed, and sometimes Jake would wake up in the middle of the night to find Shadow sitting up straight, staring at the window with his ears perked forward, as if listening to sounds Jake couldn't hear, as if something out there in the darkness was calling to him. That's when Jake decided it was definitely time for a professional veterinary visit. He couldn't keep putting it off, couldn't keep telling himself that Shadow was just a weird puppy who'd grow out of these strange behaviors. He needed to know if something was wrong, needed to get Shadow his vaccinations, needed to make sure he was doing right by this creature he'd taken responsibility for. He called Riverside Veterinary Clinic and got an appointment with Dr. Sarah Chen, who came highly recommended by Maria and had 5-star reviews online. "Just bring him in for a general checkup," the receptionist said in that cheerful voice that all vet receptionists seem to have. "We'll make sure he's healthy, get his shots started, all that good stuff. It'll be fine." Jake agreed, scheduling the appointment for the following Thursday afternoon when he'd be off shift. It seemed like the responsible thing to do, the adult thing to do, especially since he was planning to officially adopt Shadow, to make this strange little creature a permanent part of his life. He'd already grown attached in that way that happens faster than you expect, where you wake up one day and realize this animal has become essential to your daily routine, that your house would feel empty without them. On the morning of the appointment, Jake loaded Shadow into a pet carrier he'd borrowed from Maria, a plastic crate with metal bars on the door that was technically meant for a cat but worked fine for a puppy Shadow's size. Shadow whined the entire way to the clinic, a sound that made Jake's heart ache, made him want to pull over and take Shadow out and hold him. "It's okay, buddy," Jake kept saying, glancing at the carrier in the passenger seat. "Just a checkup. The vet's going to make sure you're healthy. You'll be fine, I promise." The clinic was quiet when they arrived, the waiting room nearly empty in that mid-morning lull between early appointments and lunch-hour emergencies. Only one other patient, an elderly man with liver spots on his hands and a cat carrier on his lap. The man looked up when Jake entered, smiled at Shadow, who was peering out of the carrier with those intense amber eyes. "Pretty pup you've got there," the man said in that friendly way elderly people have. "What breed?" Jake realized he had no idea how to answer that question. "Mixed, I think," he said, which was probably true. "Found him as a stray?" The man nodded knowingly, his smile widening. Best dogs are always the mutts, he said with the confidence of someone who'd owned many dogs in his long life. Got more character than those purebreds, more personality. Dr. Chen came out to greet them personally before Jake had even finished filling out the new patient paperwork on the clipboard. She was younger than Jake had expected from someone with her reputation. Mid-30s at most, though her eyes had that quality of someone who'd seen a lot and learned from it. She had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that suggested she didn't have time for fussing with appearance. She wore scrubs decorated with cartoon dogs and cats, the kind of thing meant to put nervous pet owners at ease. "You must be Jake," she said, extending her hand. Her grip was firm, confident, professional. "And this is the little rescue I've heard about from my receptionist." She peered into the carrier, and Jake saw her expression change subtly. Just a slight widening of her eyes, a momentary pause, the kind of thing most people would miss, but Jake had trained himself to notice. "Oh my, he's beautiful, really beautiful. How old do you think he is?" "Best guess, about 10 weeks now," Jake said. "He was maybe 6 or 7 weeks when I found him in that house fire. It's hard to say exactly." Dr. Chen nodded slowly, still staring at Shadow with an intensity that made Jake suddenly nervous. "Let's get him into an exam room," she said, her voice still friendly but with an undertone Jake couldn't quite identify. The exam room was small but clean, with cheerful posters on the walls showing dogs and cats in various healthy poses. A golden retriever catching a frisbee, a tabby cat playing with a ball of yarn. There was a stainless steel examination table in the center of the room, and the antiseptic smell that all vet clinics have. That combination of cleaning products and animal stress. Dr. Chen had Jake lift Shadow out of the carrier and place him on the examination table. The puppy immediately pressed against Jake's chest, clearly uncomfortable in this strange new environment with its unfamiliar smells and sounds. Jake could feel Shadow's heart beating rapidly against his hands, could feel the tension in the small body. "It's okay, buddy," Jake murmured, scratching behind Shadow's ears in the way that usually calmed the puppy down. "Just a checkup. You'll be fine. I'm right here." Dr. Chen began her examination with the standard procedures Jake had seen on TV medical shows about animals. She checked Shadow's ears with an otoscope, looking for signs of infection or mites. She examined Shadow's eyes carefully, checking the pupil's response to light with a small pen light. She palpated the puppy's abdomen with gentle fingers, feeling for any abnormalities, any signs of injury or illness. She listened to Shadow's heart and lungs with her stethoscope, timing the heartbeat, listening for any irregularities in breathing or unusual sounds. Everything seemed routine, normal, and Jake started to relax. This was just a normal vet visit. Shadow was fine, healthy, just a weird puppy. Then Dr. Chen opened Shadow's mouth to check the teeth, and everything changed. Jake saw her freeze. It wasn't dramatic. She didn't gasp or step back or drop her equipment or show any obvious sign of alarm. But Jake had spent 15 years learning to read people in crisis situations, learning to spot the subtle signs that something was wrong, that panic was setting in even if the person was trying to hide it. And something was definitely wrong. Dr. Chen's hands, which had been moving with smooth, practiced efficiency through the examination, suddenly became very still. She stared at Shadow's teeth with an intensity that made Jake's stomach clench with anxiety. "Everything okay?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice casual even though his heart rate had just spiked. Dr. Chen didn't answer right away. She was staring at Shadow's teeth like they held the secrets of the universe, her brow furrowed in concentration. "How old did you say he was?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral in that way doctors use when they're about to tell you bad news. "I don't know exactly," Jake said. "Maybe 6, 7 weeks when I found him." So he'd be about 10 weeks now. Why? Is something wrong with his teeth? Dr. Chen nodded slowly, still examining the teeth, counting them, measuring them with her eyes. Then she gently closed Shadow's mouth and checked his paws, spreading the toes with her fingers, looking at the nails, examining the paw pads with intense focus. She measured the puppy's skull with her hands, feeling the bone structure. She measured the length of the snout from nose to eyes. She lifted Shadow's lips and looked at the gums. She pulled out her phone and started taking photos from different angles: the head, the paws, the teeth, the eyes. "Dr. Chen," Jake said, his voice rising with concern. "You're scaring me. Is something wrong? Is he sick?" She finally looked up, and Jake saw something in her eyes he couldn't quite identify. Concern, yes, but also wonder, and maybe fear. "Mr. Martinez," she said slowly, choosing her words carefully. "I need to ask you some questions. The house where you found Shadow, do you know anything about who lived there? What they might have been doing?" Jake shook his head, confused by the direction this was going. "Just a young family. Normal people as far as I know. They seemed nice when I talked to them that night." "Why?" Dr. Chen was quiet for a long moment, clearly thinking, clearly weighing her words. "I want to run some tests," she finally said. "Blood work, and I'd like to do a DNA test." "A DNA test?" Jake repeated. "On a dog?" Dr. Chen met his eyes, and there was something in her expression that sent ice water through Jake's veins. "Just to be safe," she said. "To know exactly what we're dealing with." There was something in the way she said "what" instead of "who" that sent a chill down Jake's spine. "What do you think he is?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'd rather not speculate until I have the results," Dr. Chen said. "But I need you to be very careful with him over the next few days. Keep him inside. Don't let him interact with other dogs. And definitely don't take him to any public places." "You're scaring me," Jake said again. Dr. Chen's expression softened slightly. "I don't mean to. He seems healthy, and he's clearly bonded to you. That's obvious from how he responds to you. Just let me run these tests. I'll have results in 48 hours. Can you wait that long?" Jake nodded, though his mind was racing. What could possibly be wrong? Shadow was just a puppy. A weird puppy, sure, with strange behaviors and unusual features. But still just a puppy, right? The next 48 hours were the longest of Jake's life. Hours that seemed to stretch into days. He kept Shadow inside, as instructed, and watched the puppy more carefully than ever, noting every behavior, every movement, looking for clues about what Dr. Chen might have seen that worried her so much. The more he watched, the more he noticed things that didn't quite add up, behaviors that seemed wrong for a normal dog. The way Shadow moved, for instance. It wasn't quite like a dog. There was something more fluid about it, more predatory, the way a cat moves rather than the bouncy gait of a puppy. The way Shadow's ears swiveled independently, tracking sounds with a precision that seemed almost mechanical. The way the puppy would sometimes just sit and stare out the window for hours, completely still, barely even breathing, like a statue or a sentinel on guard duty. And then there was the incident with Jake's neighbor's cat, an incident that made Jake's blood run cold. Jake had stepped outside to grab the mail from the box at the curb, and Shadow had slipped out between his legs before he could stop it, moving with a speed and agility that caught Jake completely off guard. Mrs. Henderson's orange tabby was sunning itself on the porch railing across the street, a fat, lazy thing that spent most of its time sleeping and demanding treats. Shadow saw it and went completely still in a way that was different from normal stillness. Not the playful stance of a puppy seeing a potential friend, not the curious posture of a dog encountering something new. This was different. This was the stance of a predator that had just spotted prey. The cat saw Shadow and immediately arched its back, its fur standing on end, hissing with a ferocity that Mrs. Henderson's lazy cat had never shown before. Shadow's lips pulled back, revealing those teeth that Dr. Chen had been so interested in, teeth that suddenly seemed longer and sharper than they should be on a puppy. For a moment, just a brief, terrifying moment, Jake was genuinely afraid that Shadow was going to attack, that he was about to watch his puppy kill a neighbor's cat in broad daylight. "Shadow, no!" Jake commanded, using his firmest voice, the voice he used on the fireground when lives were at stake and orders had to be followed immediately. The puppy immediately broke stance and trotted back to Jake, obedient and sweet, but the look in those amber eyes had changed. For just a second, Jake had seen something wild there, something that didn't belong in a suburban neighborhood with manicured lawns and white picket fences. Something ancient and dangerous and utterly foreign to the world of pet dogs and vet appointments. On the second day, at exactly 3 in the afternoon, when Jake was just getting off his shift at the fire station, his phone rang. Dr. Chen's name appeared on the caller ID. Jake's heart started pounding as he answered. "Mr. Martinez," Dr. Chen said, and her voice had a strange quality to it. Strained, tight. The voice of someone about to deliver news they wished they didn't have to deliver. "I need you to come to the clinic, right now, and bring Shadow." "The results are in?" Jake asked, though it was obvious they were. "Yes," Dr. Chen said, "and we need to talk. In person. This isn't a phone conversation. How soon can you get here?" 20 minutes, Jake said, already heading to his truck, his hands trembling slightly as he fumbled with his keys. "I'll be waiting," Dr. Chen said, and hung up without saying goodbye. The drive to the clinic felt like it took forever. Time doing that strange elastic thing again where minutes felt like hours. Jake kept glancing at Shadow in the passenger seat, the puppy sitting calmly with his nose pressed to the window, watching the world go by with those intense, intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything. "What are you?" Jake whispered, not really expecting an answer. Shadow's ear twitched, acknowledging that Jake had spoken, but the puppy didn't look at him, just kept staring out the window at a world that suddenly felt full of mysteries Jake had never imagined. When Jake pulled into the clinic parking lot, he saw Dr. Chen standing outside, waiting near the entrance. But she wasn't alone. There were 2 other people with her, a man and a woman, both wearing official-looking jackets that screamed federal government. As Jake got closer, walking across the parking lot with Shadow on a leash beside him, he could read the text embroidered on their jackets in crisp white letters, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. His stomach dropped like he'd just stepped off a cliff. Dr. Chen approached as Jake got out of the truck, her face full of apology and regret. "Jake," she said, and he could hear the emotion in her voice. "I'm so sorry, but I had to call them. It's the law. I didn't have a choice." "What's the law?" Jake asked, though part of him already knew, had known since Shadow went still and predatory at the sight of Mrs. Henderson's cat. "What did the test show?" The male wildlife officer stepped forward. He was in his 50s, with gray hair and a weathered face that had seen decades of outdoor work, the kind of face that inspired trust. "Mr. Martinez, I'm Agent Tom Bradley with Wildlife Services. This is Agent Lisa Rodriguez. We need to talk about the animal you rescued." "His name is Shadow," Jake said, feeling suddenly defensive, protective. "And he's my dog." "That's the thing, Mr. Martinez," Agent Bradley said gently, kindly, like he was trying to break bad news in the gentlest way possible. "He's not a dog." Agent Rodriguez opened a tablet and showed Jake a screen filled with what looked like scientific data. Genetic markers, charts showing DNA sequences, percentages and numbers that meant nothing to Jake. The DNA test Dr. Chen ran came back with a positive match, she explained in a calm, professional voice. Your shadow is a Canis lupus bailey, a Mexican gray wolf, one of the most critically endangered subspecies in North America. There are maybe 30 left in the wild, Mr. Martinez. Maybe. They're on the brink of extinction. Jake stared at the screen, his brain refusing to process the words. A wolf. Shadow was a wolf, not a dog with some wolf ancestry, not a wolf-dog hybrid, an actual wolf. That's impossible, he heard himself say. He's tiny. Wolves are huge. Wolf pups are small, Dr. Chen said quietly, and Jake could hear the sadness in her voice. About the size of a domestic puppy when they're born. Shadow is approximately 10 to 12 weeks old, based on his dental development and the rate of bone growth I could see in the x-rays. He won't stay small. Adult Mexican gray wolves can weigh 70 to 90 pounds. He's going to be a big animal, Jake. A dangerous animal if he's not properly cared for. Jake looked down at Shadow, who was sitting at his feet, looking up at him with those trusting amber eyes. A wolf. He'd been living with a wolf for 3 weeks, sleeping in the same room with a wolf, feeding a wolf raw meat without even realizing why Shadow preferred it. How is that even possible? Jake asked. Mexican gray wolves haven't been seen in California in, decades? Over 60 years, Agent Rodriguez said. There are only about 30 Mexican gray wolves left in the wild, all of them in protected areas in Arizona and New Mexico. They're protected under the Endangered Species Act. It's a federal crime to possess one without the proper permits. Each animal is tracked, cataloged, monitored. Their DNA is on file in our database. She looked at Shadow with something like wonder and reverence. This little guy isn't in our database, which means he's either from an illegal breeding program or… She trailed off, not wanting to finish the thought. Or what? Jake demanded, his voice sharper than he intended. Or he's from the wild, and someone captured him illegally, Agent Bradley finished. If Shadow's pack is out there somewhere, wild and undetected, this could be huge. We're talking about a potentially undiscovered population that could be critical to the survival of the entire subspecies. This could be one of the most important wildlife discoveries in decades. Jake's mind was reeling, trying to process information that seemed impossible. The house fire, he said slowly. The family said they'd never seen him before. They said he wasn't theirs. We've been looking into that, Agent Rodriguez said, her voice taking on that official tone of someone reciting investigated facts. The house was a rental. The family who was living there had only been there for 2 months. But before that, for about 6 months, the house was rented to a single man. No name on the lease, everything paid in cash. Neighbors said he kept to himself, never talked to anyone, worked odd hours. He disappeared about a week before the fire. Just vanished. Landlord said he left all his stuff behind, which was strange. You think he was keeping Shadow there? Jake asked. You think he was the one who set the fire? Agent Bradley nodded grimly. We think he might have been part of an illegal exotic animal operation. Mexican gray wolves are worth about $45,000 on the black market. There are collectors, private zoos, people who want exotic pets as status symbols. This guy might have been a middleman, holding animals before transport to buyers. We've seen this kind of operation before. And the fire? Jake asked, though he thought he already knew the answer. Could have been intentional, Agent Rodriguez said. Destroy the evidence. If this guy thought law enforcement was getting close, if he thought we were investigating him, he might have decided to burn everything and run, cut his losses, disappear. He probably assumed Shadow died in the fire, along with any other evidence of what he was doing. Jake felt sick to his stomach. This man had been willing to burn down an entire house, potentially kill a family, just to destroy evidence, and he'd been willing to let Shadow die in the flames. So what happens now? Jake asked, though he dreaded the answer. You take him away from me? The 2 agents exchanged glances. a look that suggested they'd already discussed this and didn't entirely agree on the answer. "That's what we need to discuss," Agent Bradley said. "Normally, yes. A wild animal, especially an endangered one, would be immediately transferred to a specialized facility. There's a breeding program in New Mexico and another one in Arizona. Shadow would probably go to one of those facilities, where he'd be part of efforts to save his species from extinction." "Probably?" Jake latched onto the word like a drowning man grabbing a rope. Agent Rodriguez looked at Shadow, who had moved closer to Jake and was pressing against his leg in that way he did when he was nervous or seeking comfort. "The thing is," she said slowly, choosing her words carefully, "Shadow has imprinted on you, Mr. Martinez. Wolves are incredibly social animals, and they bond deeply, especially when they're young. For the first few weeks of his life, Shadow thought he was being cared for by whoever had him in that house. Then he survived a traumatic event, the fire, and you became his savior, his protector. In Shadow's mind, you're his pack now. You're his family. That bond is real, and it's strong." Dr. Chen spoke up, and Jake could hear that she'd been doing research, that she'd been thinking about this. "I've been reading everything I can find about wolf behavior since the DNA results came in," she said. "If Shadow is separated from Jake now, at this critical age, the trauma could be severe. Wolves can literally die from stress. Their hearts can just give out. And even if he survives the separation, he might never be able to be reintroduced to other wolves. He could become too aggressive, or too withdrawn, or too dependent on humans. He might never learn to be what he's supposed to be." "So what are you saying?" Jake asked, hope and fear warring in his chest. "He can stay with me?" Agent Bradley sighed, and it was the sigh of a man who dealt with complicated situations before and knew there were no easy answers. "What we're saying is that this is complicated. Shadow can't stay with you as a pet. That's illegal, and it would be dangerous. He's going to get a lot bigger, and his instincts will get stronger. Wolves aren't domestic animals, no matter how much they might act like puppies when they're young. They're wild, and they have needs that a suburban home can't meet." "But?" Jake prompted, because there was clearly a but coming. "But there might be another option," Agent Rodriguez said. "Have you ever heard of wildlife rehabilitation facilities? Places that specialize in caring for wolves and other large predators?" Over the next hour, sitting in Dr. Chen's office while Shadow slept on Jake's lap exhausted from all the stress, the agents explained. There were facilities that specialized in caring for wolves, places where they could live in large, natural enclosures that mimicked their wild habitat while being monitored by trained professionals. Some of these facilities partnered with educational programs, helping people understand and appreciate wolves, fighting against the myths and misconceptions that had almost driven wolves to extinction in the first place. And some of them had positions for live-in caretakers, people who would work with the wolves daily, feed them, monitor their health, help them adjust to their environments, become part of the staff dedicated to conservation. The New Mexico facility, the Gray Wolf Conservation Project, has been looking for a new caretaker for about 6 months, Agent Rodriguez said, pulling up information on her tablet. "It's a small operation, but it's well-funded and well-run. They have about 8 wolves there now, including 2 Mexican Greys. If you were interested, and if you were willing to go through the training and certification process, there might be a way for you to stay in Shadow's life." Jake stared at her, his heart pounding. "You're saying I could work there? Be near Shadow?" "Not exactly with him in the way you are now," Agent Bradley cautioned, always the voice of practicality. "Shadow would be in an enclosure, living as naturally as possible. He'd be with other wolves eventually, learning to be part of a pack. But you could be involved in his care. You'd see him regularly. You'd be part of the team that makes sure he's healthy and adjusting well. And over time, as he grows and matures and becomes more of a wolf and less of a puppy, he'd still have you as a familiar presence. The transition would be easier on him if you're there. Jake looked down at Shadow, who was curled up on his lap like a regular puppy, looking peaceful and innocent, not like an endangered species or a wild animal or anything complicated. He thought about his life in Riverside, his job at the fire station, his apartment, his friends, his routines, his comfortable, predictable existence. Could he give all that up? Could he leave his job, his home, his entire life, and move to New Mexico to work at a wolf sanctuary? A week ago, even a day ago, the answer would have been an immediate and definite no. But that was before he knew what Shadow really was, before he understood what was at stake. "How long do I have to decide?" Jake asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Shadow needs to be transferred to a certified facility within 72 hours, Agent Rodriguez said, and Jake could hear the regret in her voice. "That's federal regulation. We can't bend on that. But if you're serious about the caretaker position, I can make some calls today. Fast-track your application. The facility director, Margaret Torres, is a friend of mine. She's been doing this for 40 years, and she understands these kinds of bonds. If I explain the situation, she'll work with us." "I need to think about it," Jake said. But even as he said the words, he knew he'd already made his decision. You don't save something's life and then just let it go. You don't form a bond like this, and then walk away because it's inconvenient or complicated. The agents nodded. They gave him their contact information, made him sign paperwork acknowledging that he understood Shadow's status and the legal requirements around possessing an endangered species. They were professional and kind, but Jake could see the determination in their eyes. Shadow was going to that facility in 72 hours, one way or another. The only question was whether Jake would be going with him. After the agents left, Jake sat in Dr. Chen's office for a long time, just holding Shadow, feeling the puppy's warmth and the steady rhythm of his breathing. Dr. Chen sat quietly across from him, giving him space to process everything. "What do you think I should do?" Jake finally asked. Dr. Chen smiled sadly. "I think you already know what you're going to do," she said gently. She was right. Jake spent that evening making phone calls that would change his life. He called his captain at the fire station, a man who'd been like a father to him, and explained the situation as best he could. Captain Morrison was quiet for a long time after Jake finished. "You're really going to do this?" he asked. "Leave the department for a wolf?" But there was no judgment in his voice, just understanding. "Your position will be here if you ever want to come back, Martinez, but I understand if you need to do this. Sometimes life throws you a curveball, and you just have to swing." Jake called his sister Maria, who thought he was crazy, but also said she'd support whatever decision he made, because that's what family did. He called the landlord of his apartment and explained he might need to break his lease, and surprisingly the landlord was understanding, said he'd waive the penalty given the unusual circumstances. Then Jake took a deep breath and called Agent Rodriguez. "I want to apply for the caretaker position," he said. "Whatever I need to do, whatever training or certification or anything, I'll do it. I want to stay with Shadow." "I'll call Margaret tonight," Agent Rodriguez said, and Jake could hear the smile in her voice. "I had a feeling you'd call." Things moved with surprising speed after that. The facility in New Mexico, the Gray Wolf Conservation Project, was indeed desperate for a new caretaker. Their previous caretaker had retired after 20 years, and they'd been struggling to find someone qualified who was also willing to live on-site in a fairly remote location, an hour outside of Albuquerque, in the middle of nowhere, really, where the nearest grocery store was 30 minutes away, and the nearest hospital was 45. Jake's background as a firefighter worked strongly in his favor. He was used to high-stress situations, to physical work, to following strict protocols. He could handle medical emergencies. He was responsible and mature. And his bond with Shadow was obvious to everyone who met them, a connection that couldn't be faked or manufactured. Within a week, Jake was approved. Margaret Torres herself called him, her voice warm and kind over the phone. "Agent Rodriguez told me your story," she said. "What you did, pulling Shadow from that fire. What you're willing to do now, changing your whole life for him. That's exactly the kind of person we need here. Someone who understands that these animals aren't pets, but they're not just wildlife either. They're individuals who deserve respect and care and a chance at a good life." Within 2 weeks, Jake had packed up his entire life in Riverside into a moving truck. He'd said goodbye to his crew at the fire station at a party they threw for him, everyone telling stories and getting a little drunk and slapping him on the back and saying he was crazy, but they respected him for it. He'd boxed up his belongings, donated half of what he owned because there was no point in dragging it all to New Mexico. He'd driven across the desert with Shadow in the passenger seat, the puppy watching the landscape change from urban sprawl to open wilderness with those intelligent amber eyes that seemed to understand that everything was different now, that they were going home to a place neither of them had ever been. The Gray Wolf Conservation Project was located in a valley surrounded by pine forests, the kind of landscape that looked like it had been lifted straight from a nature documentary. When Jake first saw it, driving down the long dirt road that led to the main compound, he felt something in his chest relax that he hadn't even realized was tense. This was right. This felt right. The facility consisted of several buildings, a main office and visitor center, a veterinary clinic, staff housing, and a large barn that held equipment and supplies. But the heart of the project was the wolf enclosures, large sections of land fenced with high-tensile steel that you could barely see, designed to keep the wolves safe while giving them as much natural space as possible. Margaret Torres was waiting for him when he pulled up, and she was exactly what Jake expected from someone who'd spent 40 years working with wolves. She was in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a braid, wearing practical clothes covered in mud and fur, with the kind of presence that commanded immediate respect. She greeted Jake with a firm handshake, and Shadow with a look of pure joy. "So this is our new resident," she said, crouching down to get a better look at the puppy. Shadow, as usual, stayed close to Jake, eyeing Margaret warily but without aggression. "He's perfect, absolutely perfect. And you," she looked up at Jake, "you're going to fit right in here, I can tell." The first few months were an intense adjustment period. Jake had to learn everything about wolf behavior from people who dedicated their lives to studying it. He learned to read body language, to understand the subtle communications wolves use with each other and with humans. He learned about their dietary needs, which were complex and specific. He learned about pack dynamics and social hierarchies. He learned about the medical issues unique to wolves. He learned to track, to observe, to document. It was like going back to school, except the classroom was a wolf enclosure, and the teachers were animals who could kill you if you made a serious mistake. But he also had to learn to let go, just a little bit. Shadow couldn't live in a house anymore. He couldn't sleep in Jake's bedroom or follow him around all day. He needed space, room to run, the ability to express his natural behaviors. Shadow's enclosure was massive, almost 5 acres of natural terrain, complete with a stream that ran through it year-round, rocks for climbing and sunbathing, dens that had been dug into hillsides, and plenty of places to explore. It was connected to 2 other enclosures, where the facility housed 3 other Mexican gray wolves. 2 females named Luna and Sierra, who were sisters, and an elderly male named Cisco, who'd been at the facility for 12 years after being hit by a car as a young wolf and losing most of his sight in one eye. The plan, Margaret explained, was to eventually introduce Shadow to Luna and Sierra, to let him learn to be part of a pack. But that would take time, patience, careful management. For now, Shadow had his own space, and Jake visited him every single day, multiple times a day, helping with feeding and health checks, and just spending time near the enclosure so Shadow would know Jake hadn't abandoned him. In the beginning, Shadow was clearly distressed when Jake left. The young wolf would whine and pace along the fence line, watching Jake walk away with an expression that broke Jake's heart into a million pieces. But gradually, very gradually, as the days turned into weeks and the weeks turned into months, Shadow began to adjust. He started exploring his enclosure more, spending less time watching for Jake and more time investigating every corner of his new territory. He played in the stream, splashing in the water and snapping at fish, even though he couldn't catch any. He climbed on the rocks, perching on the highest point like he was surveying his kingdom. He dug test holes, practicing the denning behavior that wolves use in the wild. Jake watched him grow, and it was astonishing. By 6 months, Shadow had tripled in size and barely resembled the tiny creature Jake had pulled from the fire. His puppy features had sharpened into something distinctly lupin. His build had become more muscular, his movements more fluid and powerful. The wolf was emerging from the puppy, and it was simultaneously heartbreaking and beautiful to watch. By 9 months, Shadow stood almost 2 feet tall at the shoulder and weighed close to 60 pounds. His coat had thickened for winter, making him look even larger. His amber eyes had darkened slightly, becoming more intense. And yet, whenever Jake approached the enclosure, Shadow would still come running, would still press against the fence to be as close to Jake as possible, would still make that soft whining sound that Jake had learned meant recognition, affection. A greeting that said, "I remember you. You're my person, even though I'm becoming something wild." The bond hadn't broken. It had just evolved, transformed into something different, but no less real. One day, about a year after Jake had moved to New Mexico, Margaret approached him with an update that both excited and terrified him. "I think it's time," she said. "Time to start introducing Shadow to Luna and Sierra. He's showing all the right behaviors. He's mature enough. He needs a pack." Jake felt his stomach twist with anxiety. He knew this was coming, knew it was necessary, knew that Shadow needed to learn how to be a wolf among wolves, not just a wolf among humans. But the idea of Shadow being with the other wolves, potentially getting into conflicts, potentially getting hurt in the dominance struggles that were a natural part of pack formation, it scared him more than running into a burning building ever had. David, the facility's senior behavioral biologist, must have seen something in Jake's face because he said gently, "It's natural to be worried. But Shadow needs this, Jake. He needs to learn how to be part of a pack. Right now, in his mind, you're his pack. That's not sustainable long term. Not for him and not for you. He needs to learn the social skills that will let him thrive, maybe even eventually contribute to breeding programs that could save his species." "I know," Jake said. And he did know, intellectually at least. "I just want to make sure we do it right." "We will," Margaret assured him, putting a hand on his shoulder. "We'll start with fence line introductions. Let them see each other, smell each other, get used to each other's presence without any possibility of physical contact. We'll watch their body language obsessively. If there are any signs of serious aggression or extreme stress, we'll slow down. We won't force anything. This will probably take months, Jake. It's not a quick process." "And Cisco?" Jake asked. "Will he be part of this?" Margaret shook her head. "Cisco's too old and too set in his ways. He's been alone for years, and at this point it would be cruel to force him into a new social situation. He'll stay in his own enclosure, happy and peaceful. But Luna and Sierra are young enough and social enough that they should accept Shadow eventually. They might even be excited to have a male join their group, to have the possibility of forming a real pack structure." The introduction process began the following week, and it was simultaneously fascinating and nerve-wracking to watch. Jake and the rest of the team moved a section of portable fencing to create a buffer zone between Shadow's enclosure and the one where Luna and Sierra lived. This allowed the three wolves to see and smell each other without any possibility of physical contact, letting them get used to each other's presence gradually and safely. Shadow's reaction was immediate and intense, more dramatic than Jake had expected. The moment he caught sight of the two female wolves, he became completely fixated, his entire body tense with excitement or anxiety, or maybe both. He paced along the fence line endlessly, whining in a way Jake had never heard before, his whole body practically vibrating with energy. Luna and Sierra were more cautious in their approach. They came to investigate slowly, sniffing along their side of the fence, their body language curious but wary, two females trying to figure out what this strange male wolf was and whether he was a threat or an opportunity. "This is actually really good," David said, watching through high-powered binoculars from a safe observation distance. "No aggression from any of them. Shadow's showing submissive behaviors. See how his ears are back? He's trying to communicate that he's not a threat, that he's not challenging them. That's exactly what we want to see." Over the next few weeks, the three wolves spent hours each day at the fence line, slowly getting used to each other's presence. Jake watched their interactions obsessively, taking detailed notes, recording video, looking for any sign that things were going wrong. But things seemed to be going remarkably right. Shadow's initial anxious excitement gradually calmed into something more stable, more sustainable. Luna, the larger of the two females, and clearly the more dominant personality, became particularly interested in Shadow. She would spend long periods sitting on her side of the fence, while Shadow sat on his. The two of them just being in each other's presence, sometimes for hours at a time. A patient courtship that reminded Jake that wolves weren't like dogs, weren't impulsive or rushing. They took their time with important decisions like pack formation. By the 2-month mark of fence line introductions, with winter turning into spring and the valley coming alive with new growth, Margaret made the decision to move forward with direct introduction. They would start with Shadow, meeting Luna one-on-one in a neutral space, a small enclosure that none of the wolves had spent significant time in before, while Sierra watched from an adjacent area. It was the safest way to do this, the most controlled environment they could create for what was fundamentally a risky process. Jake was a complete nervous wreck the morning of the introduction. He'd barely slept the night before, running through all the possible things that could go wrong, all the ways Shadow could get hurt or hurt one of the others, all the scenarios that ended in disaster. Margaret had to physically put her hands on his shoulders and look him in the eyes. "Jake," she said firmly, "he's going to be okay. You have to trust him. Trust what we've taught him. Trust what we've observed in these fence line meetings. Shadow is ready for this, and Luna is ready. They want this. Can you see that?" Jake nodded, not trusting himself to speak around the lump in his throat. They moved Shadow to the introduction enclosure first. The young wolf was clearly agitated, pacing the perimeter, sniffing every corner of the new space obsessively, trying to understand where he was and what was happening. Then they opened the gate and let Luna in, and Jake's heart felt like it might explode out of his chest. For a long moment, the two wolves just stared at each other across the space. Shadow dropped into a playbow, his front legs stretched forward, his rear end up in the air, tail wagging slightly in a gesture that Jake had learned meant friendly intentions, an invitation to interact peacefully. It was a vulnerable position, a submissive gesture that showed Luna he wasn't trying to dominate her. Luna's response was to approach slowly, her posture neutral but confident. Not aggressive, but not overly friendly either. Testing, evaluating, making her own decisions about whether this male wolf was worthy of her time and trust. The two wolves circled each other slowly, a careful dance that seemed to last forever, but probably only took a few minutes. Shadow kept his body low, his tail tucked slightly, every line of his posture screaming submission and respect. Luna moved with confidence, clearly establishing that she was the one in charge here, that Shadow would have to earn his place in any pack structure they might form. Then, to Jake's amazement and overwhelming relief, Luna's tail wagged. Just slightly, just a small movement. But it was there. An acceptance, an approval. She stepped closer to Shadow and touched her nose to his in a gesture that was clearly friendly, clearly welcoming. Shadow's whole body seemed to sigh with relief, every tense muscle relaxing. His tail wagged harder, no longer submissive but genuinely happy. Luna circled him once more, claiming him with her scent, then suddenly broke into a run. Shadow immediately gave chase, and the two wolves began running through the enclosure together, playing in the way wolves play, which involved a lot of mock fighting and chasing and tumbling that looked violent, but was actually just joy made physical. Jake felt tears streaming down his face before he even realized he was crying. Margaret squeezed his shoulder. "He's got a pack now," she said softly. "He's home." The full integration of Shadow into Luna and Sierra's group took another 6 months of careful management and gradual introduction. There were minor scuffles as the three wolves established their hierarchy, moments of tension when someone got too pushy or someone else pushed back. But there were also moments of beauty that took Jake's breath away and made every sacrifice worthwhile. The three wolves sleeping in a pile on cold nights, their bodies intertwined for warmth. Shadow and Luna play fighting, rolling around in the grass with clear affection. All three wolves howling together at twilight, their voices blending in that ancient, haunting harmony that humans have been hearing for thousands of years, that speaks to something deep and primal in our own nature. Jake still visited Shadow every day, still helped with feeding and health checks and observation. But his role had fundamentally changed. He was no longer Shadow's primary source of companionship and security. That came from the pack now, from Luna and Sierra, as it should. Shadow still acknowledged Jake, would still approach the fence when he saw him, would still make that soft, whining sound of recognition and greeting. But Shadow's focus had shifted. His world had expanded beyond Jake to include other wolves, and that was exactly what was supposed to happen. It was healthy. It was right. It was heartbreaking and beautiful all at once. One evening, about 2.5 years after Jake had pulled Shadow from that burning house, he was sitting outside his small cabin on the facility grounds, watching the stars come out in a sky unpolluted by city lights. The facility was quiet. The wolves settled for the night. Margaret came and sat beside him without invitation, holding 2 mugs of coffee that steamed in the cool mountain air. "I've been thinking about writing a book," she said, handing Jake one of the mugs. "About Shadow. About you. About how sometimes the universe puts the right person in the right place at exactly the right time." Jake accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. "You think the universe plans things like that?" Margaret smiled, her eyes crinkling with decades of wisdom. "Maybe not plans, exactly, but maybe allows. Shadow shouldn't have survived that fire. By all rights, he should have died, either from smoke inhalation or from burns or just from the trauma. But he didn't because you were there. And you weren't supposed to be there either. Didn't you tell me your shift was supposed to end before that call came in? It was a series of small chances, tiny coincidences, that led to Shadow being in your life. And me being in his," Jake added quietly. "Do you ever regret it?" Margaret asked. "Giving up your old life? The fire department, your friends, the city, all of it?" Jake thought about it, really thought about it, considering the question seriously. He thought about his apartment in Riverside with its convenient parking and nearby grocery stores. He thought about his job at the fire station, the camaraderie with his crew, the satisfaction of helping people in their worst moments. He thought about the future he'd imagined for himself 2.5 years ago, which hadn't included wolves or New Mexico or any of this. "No," he said finally, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. Not for a second, not even a little bit. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking their coffee, watching the stars multiply overhead as the sky darkened. Then, from the direction of the enclosures, came the sound Jake had learned to love more than any other. Howling. Shadow's voice first, deep and clear and strong, the voice of a fully mature wolf. Then Luna's, harmonizing with his. Then Sierra's, adding a higher note that completed the chord. The three voices wove together, rising into the night sky, wild and free and achingly beautiful. Jake closed his eyes and listened, letting the sound wash over him. This was his life now. These sounds, this place, these wild creatures who had taught him so much about resilience and adaptation and the importance of finding where you belong, of becoming who you're supposed to be. He'd pulled Shadow from the fire, but in a very real way, Shadow had pulled him from a different kind of fire. The slow burn of a life that was fine, but not fulfilling. Comfortable, but not passionate. Safe, but not truly alive. "Thank you, Shadow," Jake whispered into the darkness, his words carried away on the mountain breeze. From the enclosure, as if in response, came one more howl. Just Shadow this time, a single pure note that seemed to hang in the air forever before fading into silence. Margaret laughed softly. "I think he heard you." "I think he did too," Jake agreed. Years passed. Shadow lived a long, healthy life at the facility, eventually becoming the alpha male of a pack that grew to include several other wolves over time, both rescues and cubs born at the facility as part of the breeding program. He never lost his recognition of Jake, never stopped approaching the fence when Jake called his name, never stopped making that soft, whining sound of greeting that meant, "I remember you, I know who you are, you're important to me." But he was wild, truly wild in every way that mattered. He hunted the rabbits that sometimes made their way into the enclosure. He marked his territory with the fierce possessiveness of an alpha. He fought off challenges from younger males with skill and strategy. He courted Luna with patience, and eventually, after 2 years together, they had cubs. Tiny, mewling things that filled Jake with wonder and hope for the future of the species. And Jake? He stayed at the facility for the rest of his career, eventually becoming director when Margaret retired at 70. He helped save and rehabilitate dozens of wolves over the years, each one with their own story, their own journey from danger to safety, from isolation to pack. But none of them ever quite captured his heart the way Shadow had. Because Shadow wasn't just a wolf he'd saved. Shadow was the wolf who had changed everything, who had shown him that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let yourself be pulled in a new direction. Even when it's terrifying, even when it doesn't make sense to anyone else, even when you have to give up everything familiar to follow where fate is leading. On the night Shadow finally passed away, old and content at the age of 14, ancient for a wolf, a testament to the quality of care he'd received, Jake sat outside the enclosure and did something he'd never done before. He howled. It was a clumsy, human howl, nothing like the beautiful song Shadow had mastered. But it was his goodbye, his thank you, his acknowledgement of a bond that had transcended species and circumstance and all the normal rules of the world. And from somewhere in the darkness, the other wolves howled back. Luna, who was still alive and grieving in her own way. Sierra. The younger wolves who'd grown up knowing Shadow as their alpha. All of them saying goodbye to their packmate, singing him into whatever comes next for wolves when their time on Earth is finished. Jake listened to their song and felt at peace. Shadow's journey had been wild and strange and beautiful and impossible. From a burning house to a wolf sanctuary, from a tiny puppy who shouldn't have survived to a strong alpha who lived a full, wild life. It was the kind of story that seemed impossible, except that it had happened. Except that it was real. Except that Jake had lived it. The flames had consumed half the house, but they hadn't consumed Shadow. And in saving Shadow, Jake had found the missing piece of his own life he hadn't even known he was looking for. Sometimes rescue looks like running into a burning building. Sometimes it looks like making a phone call that changes your whole life. Sometimes it looks like letting go of who you were so you can become who you're meant to be. And sometimes rescue looks like two glowing eyes in the darkness, a tiny creature trembling in your hands, and the immediate, unshakable knowledge that whatever happens next, you're in this together, for better or worse, until the very end. That's what Jake learned from Shadow. That's what Shadow's story teaches all of us, if we're willing to listen. We're all capable of being rescued. We're all capable of being rescuers. And sometimes, the line between the two is so blurred that you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. Shadow's legacy lived on at the Grey Wolf Conservation Project long after his death, not just in the bloodline he'd passed down through generations of cubs, but in the hearts of everyone who'd known his story. He became a symbol of why the work mattered, why endangered species conservation was so crucial, why every single life, even one tiny wolf pup in a burning house, was worth saving, worth fighting for, worth changing your entire life to protect. Jake kept a photo on his desk in the director's office for the rest of his career. Shadow, at 3 years old, sitting on his favorite boulder that overlooked the entire enclosure, silhouetted against a New Mexico sunset that painted the sky in shades of orange and purple and gold. Wild, free, magnificent, exactly where he belonged. And every time Jake looked at that photo, he remembered. The weight of that tiny body tucked inside his firefighter's coat. The sound of that desperate whimper in the darkness. The feeling of those glowing amber eyes meeting his through the smoke and flames. He remembered making a choice to reach in, to save, to care, not knowing that choice would change absolutely everything about his life. But that's the thing about the moments that define our lives, isn't it? We never see them coming. We just respond with whatever courage or compassion or recklessness we have in that moment. We reach into the fire not knowing what we'll pull out. We pull out the life that needs saving, not knowing that in saving it, we'll save ourselves too. And then we hold on tight and see where the journey takes us, trusting that somewhere at the end of it all, we'll find where we were always meant to be. For Jake Martinez and Shadow the Wolf, the journey had taken them exactly where they both needed to go. Together at first, then apart, then forever connected across the barrier between wild and human, between the life that was and the life that became, between who they were and who they were always meant to be. It was a good story, a true story, the kind of story that reminds us why we tell stories in the first place. To remember that miracles happen, that second chances exist, that sometimes, in the midst of destruction and chaos and everything falling apart, something beautiful survives, something worth saving, something that will save you right back if you're brave enough to let it.